The most dangerous report in the United States Army sat locked in a filing cabinet at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, stamped secret and buried under classification restrictions that wouldn't lift for 2 decades. 3 Army engineers had spent 6 weeks testing a captured German Panther tank against an American M4 Sherman in head-to-head trials that measured everything from armor penetration to fuel consumption to crew survivability. The results destroyed every assumption American tankers held about German superiority, proved that the tank America's enemies called the best in the world was actually a mechanical disaster, and created a problem that terrified the War Department. If American soldiers learned the truth, they might stop fearing German armor. If the American public learned the truth, they'd demand to know why the Army had been claiming German tanks were invincible when captured examples kept breaking down from basic use. So the report stayed classified, the tests stayed secret, and for 20 years the myth of German tank superiority remained intact, while 3 engineers who knew the truth weren't allowed to speak. The Panther arrived at Aberdeen Proving Ground in January 1944, one of the first intact examples captured in Italy after German crews abandoned it during a retreat. American tankers in Europe were already calling the Panther the most dangerous opponent on the battlefield. A 45-ton monster with sloped armor that deflected American shells and a 75mm high-velocity gun that could punch through a Sherman's front plate at over a mile. Intelligence reports described it as mechanically superior to anything the Allies fielded, tactically versatile enough to serve as both tank destroyer and breakthrough weapon, and proof that German engineering had created armor the United States couldn't match. The Panther's reputation was so fearsome that Sherman crews were being told to avoid head-to-head engagements, to rely on numerical superiority rather than fighting fair, because a fair fight against a Panther meant American tankers died. Aberdeen's testing staff had strict orders about what to examine and what to ignore. They would measure armor thickness and gun penetration because those statistics were uncontroversial and matched what field reports already confirmed. They would not, under any circumstances, make public statements about German engineering quality or compare overall combat effectiveness in ways that might embarrass either the Army's procurement decisions or America's industrial production. The tests were supposed to confirm German superiority in a controlled way that explained American casualties without questioning whether the Sherman program had been a mistake. What the engineers found instead was that the Panther was a disaster. The first test was basic mobility, driving the Panther and a standard Sherman across the same obstacle course that every American tank had to pass before being approved for service. The Sherman completed the course in 34 minutes. The Panther broke down after 18 minutes when the final drive gears stripped themselves apart from the torque of climbing a steep incline. German final drives were designed for the Panther's original 35-ton weight, but the tank had grown to 45 tons during development, and the drivetrain had never been upgraded to handle the increased load. The engineers repaired the final drive using parts cannibalized from another captured Panther, then tried the test again. The Panther broke down after 22 minutes, different final drive, same failure mode. The second round of tests examined fuel consumption and operational range, critical factors for armies that had to move tanks hundreds of miles between battles. The Sherman's Ford GAA engine consumed approximately 1.5 gallons per mile under combat conditions, giving it an operational range of roughly 120 miles on a full tank. The Panther's Maybach HL230 engine consumed 2.8 gallons per mile, giving it a range of barely 60 miles before requiring refueling. The implications were staggering because fuel logistics determined what armies could accomplish strategically. An American armored division could advance 120 miles before its supply trucks needed to catch up. A German panzer division equipped with Panthers had to stop and refuel after 60 miles, doubling the logistical burden and cutting advance rates in half.
The armor penetration tests produced results that matched German reputation. The Panther's 75mm KWK-42 gun could penetrate a Sherman's front armor at 2,000 yards, while the Sherman's 75mm gun couldn't reliably penetrate the Panther's front plate even at point-blank range. This was the statistic that American tankers already knew from brutal experience, and it was the reason tank crews called the Sherman a death trap when facing Panthers. But the engineers noticed something the field reports hadn't emphasized. The Panther's superior gun was mounted in a tank that could barely drive to the battlefield and would likely break down before firing all its ammunition. The maintenance requirements revealed the engineering nightmare that German crews were living with every day. The Panther's engine required a complete removal from the hull to perform routine maintenance like changing spark plugs or adjusting valves. The process took a trained crew between 24 and 36 hours with proper lifting equipment. The Sherman's engine could be removed and replaced in under 4 hours with a crew with basic mechanical knowledge. The Panther's interleaved road wheel design, which looked impressive and provided a smooth ride, meant that changing a single damaged inner wheel required removing up to 8 outer wheels first, a process that could take an entire day. The Sherman's independent road wheels could be changed individually in under an hour. The reliability tests demonstrated why German panzer divisions were shrinking while American armored divisions were growing. Aberdeen's engineers drove both tanks until they broke down, then repaired them and drove them again, repeating the cycle to measure mean time between failures. The Sherman averaged 146 hours of operation between breakdowns requiring more than field-level maintenance. The Panther averaged 38 hours between failures, and several of those failures were catastrophic enough to require factory-level repair or complete replacement of major assemblies. A tank that spent more time being repaired than fighting was tactically worthless, regardless of how impressive it looked on paper. By March 1944, the test results were conclusive and deeply problematic. The Panther was superior in a single metric that mattered enormously in individual tank versus tank combat, but inferior in every metric that mattered for actually winning a war. It couldn't drive as far, couldn't operate as long, couldn't be repaired as quickly, and couldn't be produced in numbers that made strategic difference. The Sherman was a better tank, not because it won duels, but because it could reach the battlefield in working order, stay there longer, and be repaired quickly enough to fight again the next day. The Army had been telling the truth when it said German tanks were individually superior, but it had been missing the larger truth that individual superiority didn't matter when your tanks couldn't reliably show up.
The engineers submitted their report to the Ordnance Department in April 1944 with recommendations that were ignored because they created political problems nobody wanted to address. The data proved that American industrial strategy of building large numbers of reliable, maintainable tanks was correct, but it also proved that American tankers were being sent into combat in vehicles that would lose head-to-head engagements with Panthers if the German tank actually worked. The Ordnance Department couldn't publish findings that might be interpreted as validating the Sherman's design without addressing why Sherman crews were dying in numbers that suggested design flaws. They also couldn't publish findings that made German engineering look incompetent without explaining why the war was taking so long if German equipment was so unreliable. The classification decision came from the top of the War Department, with orders that the Aberdeen tests would remain secret until further notice. The official justification was that revealing detailed information about captured German tanks would compromise intelligence sources, but the real reason was simpler. The American public believed German tanks were superior because that's what the Army had been saying to explain casualties, and suddenly claiming German tanks were actually mechanical disasters would create questions about Army competence and honesty that nobody wanted to answer during an election year. The truth would stay buried until it was historically safe to admit that American propaganda had been partially wrong. The report's classification created an impossible situation for American tank crews in Europe who were still being trained to fear Panthers as invincible opponents.
Crews who could have benefited from knowing that German tanks broke down frequently were instead told to avoid combat and rely on numerical superiority, which was tactically sound advice, but psychologically devastating because it reinforced the sense that American equipment was inferior. Sherman crews went into battle believing they were driving death traps facing superior opponents, when the truth was that their reliability and maintainability made them superior weapons in every way that mattered for winning a war of attrition. The Germans knew their own tanks' weaknesses but couldn't fix them because the engineering decisions that caused the problems were baked into designs that couldn't be changed without starting from scratch. Panther production continued through 1945 because Germany had committed to the design and didn't have time to develop replacements, but German tank crews were increasingly bitter about driving vehicles that spent more time broken than fighting. Captured German documents from late 1944 showed panzer divisions reporting that less than 40% of their Panthers were operational at any given time, with the majority deadlined for maintenance or awaiting parts that weren't available. The Aberdeen report stayed classified through the end of the war and into the occupation, buried under security restrictions that had stopped making sense the moment Germany surrendered. But bureaucratic inertia kept it locked away because nobody wanted to take responsibility for declassifying a document that would force the Army to explain why it had suppressed information about German tank weaknesses while American soldiers were dying fighting them. The classification remained in effect through the 1950s as the Cold War created new reasons to keep old secrets buried. The declassification finally came in 1964, 20 years after the tests, when a Freedom of Information Act request forced the Army to review the classification status of World War II technical reports. The Aberdeen Panther tests were downgraded to unclassified, the report was released to researchers, and military historians finally gained access to data that confirmed what German veterans had been saying privately for years. The Panther was an impressive design on paper, but a nightmare in practice, and the myth of German tank superiority had been more about propaganda than engineering reality. The revelation didn't change history, but it changed how history was understood, proving that American tank design philosophy of reliability over performance had been strategically correct, even when it was tactically disadvantageous. The Sherman's weaknesses in armor and firepower were real and cost American lives, but the Panther's weaknesses in reliability and maintainability cost Germany the war, because tanks that don't run can't fight. The test that proved this had been classified for 2 decades, not because it revealed secrets that would help enemies, but because it revealed truths that would embarrass the Army. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're covering the classified tests and buried reports that proved the official story was incomplete. Drop a comment telling us whether the Army was right to classify results that might have saved lives by reducing fear of German tanks, or whether soldiers deserved the truth regardless of political convenience, because that question about when truth matters less than morale defines how militaries balance honesty with effectiveness.